The air in the private lounge was thick with the scent of expensive cigars and the sharp tang of aged whiskey. A group of wealthy men sat in their leather chairs, each one boasting, laughing, and tossing around absurd wagers. These weren't ordinary men, they were billionaires, heirs to fortunes, or self-made tycoons who had grown bored of luxury. They needed a new thrill. "Love is nothing but a game," one of them scoffed, swirling his drink. "Marriage? Just a contract. You throw in some flattery, keep up appearances, and in the end, the lawyers sort it out." The others chuckled, nodding in agreement. But then, one voice cut through the air. "You think it's all a game?" A man named Lennox smirked, setting down his glass. "Then why not prove it?" There was a pause. The others turned to him, intrigued. Lennox, a wealthy hedge fund manager with a reputation for daring bets, leaned forward. "I bet none of you could marry someone society deems undesirable, someone people mock, and stay with her for a year. No cheating. No backing out." The room fell silent for a moment before an eruption of laughter. "That's the most ridiculous bet I've ever heard," one man said, shaking his head. But Lennox wasn't finished. "Here's the deal. You pick the woman. You marry her. Treat it like a real relationship, no public scandals, no mistresses. Do it for a full year, and I'll put $10 million on the table." The laughter faded. Now, they were listening. Then, a man spoke, the one who always saw life as a game. Caleb Vance. At 32 years old, Caleb was the kind of man people either envied or despised. He was handsome, charming, and richer than most would ever dream to be. Women adored him, men wanted to be him, and life had never truly challenged him. He smirked, adjusting the gold cufflinks on his tailored suit. "10 million, he echoed. "You're seriously willing to pay that just to see one of us play house with, what, an outsider?" Lennox grinned. "What's wrong, Caleb? Afraid you'll actually fall in love?" The table roared with amusement. Caleb leaned back, considering it. He had never lost a bet in his life. Women were easy. Love? A joke. And $10 million was easy money. So, with a slow, confident smile, he reached for his glass and raised it. "You're on." A woman he never expected. The next week, the men met again, only this time, they weren't just drinking and laughing. They were picking Caleb's wife. Lennox had come prepared. He had a folder in his hand, a stack of papers that made Caleb frown. "Let's make this interesting," Lennox said, sliding the folder across the table. "Inside are profiles of women who fit the challenge." Caleb raised an eyebrow and flipped it open. There were several women inside. Some were plain-looking, others had visible physical scars, and a few had rough backgrounds. But one profile stood out. A woman named Rosalind Carter. She was overweight, standing at nearly 250 pounds, with simple brown hair and soft features. She wasn't conventionally attractive, not by society's harsh standards, anyway. But her eyes, there was something in them. A quiet strength. She worked as an art teacher, spent weekends volunteering, and never married because she didn't believe in settling for anything less than love. The irony made Caleb laugh. She was perfect for the bet. He closed the folder and smirked. "I'll marry her." Lennox raised an eyebrow. "You sure?" Caleb's smirk deepened. "It'll be easy." The first meeting, finding Rosalind, wasn't hard. She had a small but comfortable life, working in a modest art studio in the city. Caleb, ever the charmer, showed up one evening with a carefully crafted story. He introduced himself as an investor interested in funding art programs for underprivileged kids. He was smooth, polite, and had every detail about her memorized. Rosalind was caught off guard. She had never had someone like Caleb look at her with interest. At first, she was skeptical. Why would a man like him notice a woman like her? But Caleb had a way of making people trust him. He listened, asked questions, and acted fascinated by her passion for art. Within a month, she was falling for him. Within 2, he proposed. And 3 months later, they were married. The wedding that wasn't a wedding, there were no extravagant vows. No big celebration. Caleb insisted on a small ceremony, just close friends and a quick reception. He convinced her it was because he wanted something intimate. The truth? He didn't want the world to see it as real. He told himself it was just a game. A one-year performance. But the moment he saw Rosalind standing at the altar, smiling at him with absolute trust, something twisted inside his chest. Guilt. He shoved it down. This was a bet. Nothing more. After the wedding, he played the perfect husband. He kissed her in public, held her hand, and smiled when the cameras flashed. But in private? He kept his distance. It should have been easy. And yet, something about Rosalind unnerved him. She wasn't desperate for his love. She didn't cling to him or try to change herself. She just lived. She laughed. She painted. She cared about people. And when people whispered about her weight, when others sneered behind her back, she didn't flinch. She was stronger than him. And that terrified him. The cracks began to show, the days turned into weeks. Caleb watched Rosalind from a distance, pretending not to care. But the more he watched, the more he realized something dangerous. He wasn't pitying her. He wasn't enduring her. He was admiring her. And that was not part of the plan. One night, they attended a charity event together. The rich socialites whispered as Rosalind walked in beside him. She's with Caleb? Why? What does he see in her? Is this a joke? Caleb expected Rosalind to wilt under the judgment. Instead, she stood taller. She smiled, completely unfazed. And then, she did something that stunned him. She turned to Caleb, took his hand, and squeezed it gently. "Don't let them bother you," she whispered. "You don't need their approval." Caleb's breath caught. Not her approval. Not her acceptance. His. As if he was the one who needed reassurance. As if he was the one who wasn't enough. And for the first time since making the bet, he felt something shift inside him. Caleb never lost a bet. Not in his entire life. And yet, as he lay awake that night, staring at the ceiling of the luxury penthouse, something in his chest felt off. Rosalind had been asleep for hours, her side of the bed untouched by his presence. They were technically married, but they might as well have been strangers sharing a lease. That was supposed to be the plan. And yet, he couldn't shake her words from his head. Don't let them bother you. You don't need their approval. She had said it so simply, as if the judgment of the world didn't matter. As if she truly believed that what people thought of them, of her, of him, was irrelevant. How? How could someone who had been mocked, dismissed, and overlooked stand so confidently? Caleb turned in bed, watching her from a distance. She was peaceful. Content. That was the difference between them. She was at peace. And he? He was the one faking everything. Pretending to be the perfect husband. The next morning, Caleb resumed his role. He greeted Rosalind with a smooth smile, kissed her cheek like a devoted husband, and poured her coffee while making sure everything looked real. In public, he was the doting husband. He pulled out her chair at restaurants. He placed a protective hand on her back when crossing streets. He laughed at her jokes, whispered in her ear, and let the world believe he was madly in love. At first, Rosalind blushed at the attention. She had never been adored so openly before, and for a moment, Caleb felt a twinge of guilt. He wasn't really in love. This was just an act. But she didn't know that. And the way she lit up when he treated her like she was the most beautiful woman in the world. It was starting to make him feel like a villain. She wasn't like the others in Caleb's world. Relationships were nothing but transactions. Women chased him. They wanted things, fancy dinners, jewelry, vacations. But Rosalind never asked for anything. Not once. She didn't expect gifts. She didn't demand attention. She just lived. She spent her mornings painting in the sunroom, losing herself in color and light. She hummed while she worked, a soft melody that drifted through the penthouse. Caleb watched her without meaning to. He would walk by, pausing in the doorway, staring as she moved the brush across the canvas. She was happy. Not because of money. Not because of him. She was just happy. He didn't understand it. He had everything: wealth, power, status. And yet, he had never once felt the kind of contentment she had. Why? The first unexpected emotion, it happened 3 weeks into their marriage. They were at a dinner party with Caleb's associates, the kind of elite gathering where people only spoke in deals, investments, and numbers. Rosalind, in a navy blue dress that didn't try to hide her body, stood beside him, listening politely as the conversation unfolded. At first, Caleb thought nothing of it. But then, he heard the whispers. "Did you see his wife? I didn't expect Caleb to marry, well, her. Is this some kind of social experiment?" The laughter was soft but cruel. Rosalind must have heard. And yet, she didn't react. She simply sipped her wine, completely unfazed. Caleb's stomach twisted. Why wasn't she angry? Why wasn't she hurt? It was him who felt the sting of their words. He turned to her, frowning. "Rosalind, do you?" She smiled at him, her eyes warm. "Are you okay?" she asked him. Him. The one who had placed a bet on her. The one who was pretending. Caleb opened his mouth, but no words came out. For the first time in his life, he didn't know how to respond. And that terrified him. Something had changed after that night. Caleb couldn't ignore it anymore. Rosalind wasn't weak. She wasn't insecure. She was the strongest person in the room. And that made him feel small. He started watching her more carefully. How she interacted with people. How she spoke with kindness, but never let anyone walk over her. He noticed how much people actually loved her. At an art gallery she had curated, he saw children run to her, laughing and pulling her toward their paintings. He watched elderly women greet her like an old friend. He overheard a conversation between her and a young artist who had been on the verge of quitting. "The world will tell you who you should be," Rosalind had said softly. "But you decide who you are. Don't let them take that from you." Caleb had walked away, shaken. She was supposed to be the joke. The woman he married for a bet. So why was she becoming the most extraordinary person he had ever met? Jealousy, or something else? One evening, Caleb came home late, expecting to find Rosalind waiting for him like a dutiful wife. Instead, he found the penthouse empty. Confused, he checked his phone. No messages. A strange, unfamiliar feeling crept into his chest. Where was she? He wasn't used to this. Women waited for him. They adjusted their schedules to fit his. But Rosalind wasn't waiting. She was out living her life. And for the first time, Caleb realized he didn't like it. A sharp, irrational thought hit him. What if she finds someone better? He froze. Where had that thought come from? He was the one in control. She was supposed to need him. Not the other way around. So why did it feel like he was the one chasing her? A shift he couldn't ignore. When Rosalind finally came home, he was waiting in the living room, trying to keep his emotions in check. She looked surprised to see him awake. "Caleb? Everything okay?" His jaw tightened. "Where were you?" She blinked. "At an art exhibit. It was important to one of my students." Caleb stared at her. No apology. No guilt. She had done nothing wrong. And yet, he felt something possessive twist inside him. "Next time," he said carefully, "let me know where you're going." Rosalind studied him for a moment, then smiled. Not an obedient smile. Not a submissive one. Just a simple, knowing smile. And Caleb had the horrible realization that she understood him more than he understood himself. This was no longer just a bet. Something had changed. And he wasn't sure if he could stop it. Caleb had never been the jealous type. At least, that's what he always believed. Women had always been replaceable, interchangeable, like luxury cars or expensive watches, there to enhance his life, not define it. But something was happening to him. Something he didn't understand. It started subtly. A frown when Rosalind laughed at another man's joke at a charity event. A tightness in his jaw when he saw her talking with an old friend, some childhood acquaintance, who looked at her with genuine admiration. A flicker of irritation when she cancelled dinner plans because she had an art class to teach. He didn't like the feeling. Not one bit. And yet, he couldn't stop it. The dinner party that changed everything. Caleb told himself it was just another event. Just another evening of networking, handshakes, and polite conversations. But as he and Rosalind arrived at the upscale venue, something was different. People weren't just looking at her anymore. They were noticing her. She was no longer just the wife of Caleb Vance. She was Rosalind Carter, an artist, a philanthropist, a woman with a presence that demanded respect. And it rattled him. The moment that broke him. Caleb had stepped away for a moment, caught in conversation with a business partner. When he turned and saw it, a man was standing with Rosalind, leaning just slightly too close. He was laughing, his hand gesturing animatedly as he spoke. Rosalind was smiling. Not politely. Not awkwardly. Genuinely. Caleb's stomach twisted. It wasn't an unfamiliar sight, men being drawn to her warmth. But this time, he felt something dark curl inside him. Possessiveness. She was his. And yet, for the first time, he realized he was the one afraid of losing her. The confrontation. When they got home that night, Caleb was restless. Rosalind hummed softly as she slipped off her shoes, unaware of the storm raging inside him. He sat on the edge of the bed, watching her. Finally, he couldn't take it anymore. Who was he? She paused, glancing at him. Who? The man at the party. The one you were talking to. She frowned, then smiled slightly. Oh, that was Daniel. He's an old friend. We used to take art classes together. Old friend. The words shouldn't have bothered him. But they did. And he's still single? Caleb pressed. Rosalind gave him a look. What does that have to do with anything? He shrugged, forcing himself to sound casual. Just wondering. There was a long pause. Then, she laughed. A soft, amused chuckle that made his chest tighten. What's funny? He demanded. She sat down beside him, her brown eyes warm but knowing. Caleb, are you jealous? He scoffed immediately. Of course not. She studied him, tilting her head slightly. You sure? Because it kind of feels like you are. Caleb stood abruptly, running a hand through his hair. That's ridiculous. But he was lying. And worse? She knew it. The realization he couldn't escape that night. Caleb couldn't sleep. Rosalind was beside him, breathing softly, peaceful as always. But he was wide awake, staring at the ceiling, feeling completely unhinged. Because the truth was hitting him in waves. He had married her as a bet. But somewhere along the way, it stopped being a joke. He stopped seeing her as just part of the game. And he had no idea when it happened. Was it the way she carried herself with quiet confidence? The way she never tried to impress him, because she didn't need to? The way she made him question everything about himself? Caleb squeezed his eyes shut. No. This wasn't supposed to happen. This wasn't the plan. But it was too late. He had already lost. And the worst part? He didn't even know what game he was playing anymore. The betrayal that was inevitable. Caleb's spiral didn't go unnoticed. Rosalind sensed it in the way his touch lingered longer than before. In the way his gaze softened when he thought she wasn't looking. In the way he started trying. He asked about her day. He listened to her talk about art, not just with politeness, but with genuine interest. She saw the shift. And for a brief, fleeting moment, she allowed herself to believe maybe, just maybe, this was real. That maybe, despite the odds, Caleb had fallen for her. But then, she found out the truth. The ugly truth unveiled: it was an accident. A conversation she wasn't meant to overhear. She had gone to pick up her coat after another charity event, stepping into a quiet hallway when she heard the voices. Caleb's voice. And Lennox. "Surprised you lasted this long," Lennox was saying, his tone amused. "Most of us thought you'd crack after a month." Rosalind froze. "I told you," Caleb replied, his voice lighter than it should have been. "I don't lose bets." The room spun. Bet? She felt like she couldn't breathe. Lennox chuckled. "Still, gotta admit, you picked a tough one. She actually believes you love her." Silence. Then, Caleb's voice, lower, hesitant. "Yeah. Something about the way he said it wasn't right." But Rosalind didn't hear anything after that. She turned and walked away, her heartbeat pounding in her ears. He never loved her. It was all a game. She should have known. She should have known. But she had let herself believe. And now, she had to leave. The decision: when Caleb returned to the penthouse that night, Rosalind was already waiting. She was standing in the living room, suitcase beside her, hands folded neatly in front of her. His stomach dropped. "What's going on?" he asked, carefully. She looked at him, really looked at him. And for the first time, he saw it. The pain. The quiet, heavy heartbreak she was trying so hard to hold back. "I know," she said softly. Caleb's heart stopped. "Know what?" She exhaled. "The bet." Silence. For the first time in his life, Caleb had nothing to say. No excuse. No clever words. Just guilt. She gave him a small, sad smile. "I really thought, maybe you had changed." His throat tightened. "Rosalind, I deserved better than this," she interrupted gently. He took a step forward, something desperate rising in his chest. "Please." But she shook her head. And then, she left. Leaving Caleb alone, standing in the center of a penthouse that had never felt so empty. For the first time in his life, he realized what it meant to truly lose. Caleb stood frozen in the middle of the penthouse, the soft echo of the closing door still ringing in his ears. Rosalind was gone. The suitcase, the calm finality in her voice, it wasn't a moment of anger. It wasn't an argument where she would come back after cooling off. She had truly left him. The weight of the realization hit him harder than he thought possible. He had lost deals worth millions, made bets that fell through, and walked away from relationships without a second thought. But none of that had ever made him feel this. This hollow, suffocating emptiness. He ran a hand through his hair, pacing, trying to figure out what to do. Call her? No, she wouldn't answer. Go after her? His pride told him to let her go. But something deeper, something raw and unfamiliar, told him to chase her before it was too late. And for the first time in his life, Caleb listened to that voice. The search begins. Rosalind had nowhere to go. That was what he told himself as he drove through the city, searching for any trace of her. She didn't have many close friends. Her family was distant. Where would she run? Then it hit him. The art studio. She had always found peace there. The place she had built, where she had spent countless hours teaching, creating, dreaming. Without hesitation, Caleb turned the car around and sped toward the studio. But when he arrived, he found the door locked. His stomach clenched. She wasn't there. He banged on the door anyway, frustration bubbling to the surface. Rosalind. Silence. The city around him felt too quiet. He exhaled sharply, raking his fingers through his hair. She was really gone. And he had no one to blame but himself. Memories that weren't supposed to hurt Caleb returned home, expecting the penthouse to feel normal again. It didn't. It felt wrong. The paintings she had left behind, the soft scent of her perfume still lingering in the air, it was unbearable. He found himself walking through the rooms, stopping at places where she had been. The couch where she used to sit, painting in the evening light. The kitchen, where she made her ridiculous midnight snacks, always offering him a bite. The bedroom, where she had slept beside him, peaceful and trusting, never knowing the truth he had hidden for so long. His throat tightened. She had been real. And he had been a lie. Now, she was gone. And suddenly, winning the bet didn't matter anymore. Because the only thing he had truly won was regret. The moment of truth days passed. Caleb told himself he would move on. That he would forget. But he couldn't. The realization hit him at the most unexpected moment, when he found himself sitting alone in his office, staring at the city skyline. He had everything. Wealth. Status. Power. And yet, nothing felt right. It wasn't enough. Because the only thing that had ever made him feel alive was gone. And he had let her walk away. For the first time in his life, Caleb understood something. He had fallen in love. Not the shallow, effortless love he had mocked in the past. But the kind of love that changed a person. The kind of love that made losing unthinkable. He grabbed his phone, his fingers shaking slightly as he dialed. The call rang. Once. Twice. Then, hello? Lennox's voice. Caleb's jaw tightened. I need to talk to you. Confronting the past, Lennox agreed to meet at their usual club, a place Caleb now found suffocating. He didn't belong here anymore. Not after her. Lennox greeted him with his usual smirk. Didn't think I'd hear from you so soon. What, celebrating the win already? Caleb sat down, his expression unreadable. I lost, he said flatly. Lennox chuckled. What are you talking about? You did it. You married her. The bet was a mistake. The words felt heavy, but right. Lennox raised an eyebrow. You're serious. Caleb exhaled sharply, rubbing his temples. I never should have made that bet. Lennox leaned back, studying him. Let me guess. You actually fell for her. Silence. Then, I love her. The words were out before he could stop them. Lennox laughed. Actually laughed. Wow. That's rich. Caleb Vance, in love? You really expect me to believe that? Caleb's gaze hardened. I don't care if you believe it. Lennox shook his head, still amused. Let me remind you of something, Caleb, you're not built for love. You're built for winning. That's who you are. Caleb clenched his fists. No, he said quietly. That's who I was. Lennox's smirk faded slightly. You actually mean that, don't you? Caleb stood abruptly, throwing a few bills on the table. I'm done with this. With all of it. He turned to leave, but Lennox's voice stopped him. And what are you gonna do now? Chase after her? Beg her to take you back? Caleb didn't turn around. But his voice was steady. I'm going to prove to her that I'm not the man I used to be. And then, he walked away. For the first time, he wasn't running from something. He was running toward it. The first step toward redemption. Caleb spent the next week trying to undo the damage he had caused. He closed deals, wrapped up business obligations, anything to free himself from the life that had trapped him for so long. Then, he did something he never thought he would do. He sold the penthouse. The place that had once felt like power now felt like a prison. It was time to start over. But first, he had to find her. Finding Rosalind, it took longer than expected. She had left the city. No social media updates. No word from mutual acquaintances. She had truly disappeared. But Caleb refused to give up. And then, finally, he found her. A small town by the coast. A quiet little art shop with her name on the window. His heart pounded as he stood outside, watching her through the glass. She was painting, completely unaware that he was there. For a moment, he hesitated. What if she didn't forgive him? What if she had moved on? But then, he took a deep breath. And stepped inside. The tiny bell above the shop's entrance chimed as Caleb stepped inside. The scent of fresh paint, varnish, and something floral, something distinctly her, greeted him. For the first time in his life, he felt nervous. Rosalind sat behind a wooden counter, her head bowed as she delicately brushed color onto a canvas. She looked peaceful. She looked happy. For a brief moment, he considered turning around and walking away. But then, she lifted her head, and their eyes met. Her paintbrush slipped from her fingers, clattering onto the table. Silence. 100 emotions flashed across her face: shock, anger, confusion. But the one that hurt him most was the quiet resignation in her eyes. She had expected never to see him again. And she had made peace with that. His throat tightened. But he wasn't leaving this time. The first words, "What are you doing here?" Her voice was calm, measured. He swallowed. "I needed to see you." Rosalind exhaled, shaking her head. Why? The question was simple. But the answer wasn't. Because he didn't know how to say it. How do you tell someone that you ruined the best thing in your life, because you were too blind to see it? How do you tell someone that you never deserved them, but you're willing to spend forever trying to? I was wrong, he said finally. About everything. She scoffed. Which part? The bet? The lies? Or the fact that you thought love was a game? Each word was a knife to his chest. I was a fool, he admitted, voice raw. And I know I don't deserve your forgiveness, but stop. She held up a hand, and he fell silent. She studied him, searching his face for something. And then, she asked the one thing he wasn't prepared for. Tell me the truth, Caleb, ****, if the bet had never happened, would you have ever even noticed me? ****, the question hit like a punch to the gut. Would he have? Would the man he used to be, the man who thrived on power, control, and meaningless relationships, have ever stopped long enough to truly see her? The answer made him sick. No. And that was the tragedy of it all. Because now, after everything, he saw her more clearly than anyone else ever had. And he loved her. Completely. A truth he never wanted to face. Caleb's voice was hoarse when he finally spoke. No, Rosalind flinched. But that man? He took a step closer, his chest tightening. He doesn't exist anymore. She crossed her arms. And you expect me to believe that? No, his lips twitched into a sad smile. I expect you to never believe anything I say again. That's why I'm not asking you to listen to me. She frowned. Then what are you doing? He exhaled, finally knowing the answer. I'm here to prove it. Actions over words. Rosalind didn't trust him. And she had every right not to. So Caleb did the only thing he could. He stayed. Not in her shop, not in her space, he respected that boundary. But he found a place in town, a modest apartment, a far cry from his penthouse. He changed. Not for show. Not for her. But because he needed to. For the first time in his life, he started working, not as a billionaire with a team behind him, but as a man who wanted to understand real life. He volunteered at shelters. He helped set up art workshops for kids, the very dream she had once told him about. He didn't ask for her attention. He didn't push for forgiveness. He just stayed. Because love wasn't about grand gestures. It was about showing up. Every single day. The moment that changed everything. It took weeks. Weeks of silence. Weeks of stolen glances. Weeks of watching her try to ignore him. Until one evening, she finally snapped. It was raining. Caleb had just finished stacking chairs at a local community event when Rosalind stormed up to him, soaked and furious. "Why are you still here?" she demanded. He blinked, taken aback. "Excuse me? You should have gone back to your life by now. Your penthouse. Your business. The world you actually belong to." His jaw tightened. "I don't belong there anymore." She laughed, bitter. "You're a billionaire, Caleb. You don't belong here." He stepped forward, his voice low. "I don't care about the money." "Then what do you care about?" she shot back. His chest ached. "You." The words burned in his throat, but he knew it wasn't enough. He had said enough lies in the past. So instead, he did the only thing he could. He told her the truth. "Before you, I never knew what love was," he admitted. "I thought it was something people used as an excuse. A game." Rosalind's expression didn't change, but her fingers trembled slightly. "But then, I met you. And you weren't what I expected. You weren't someone to be pitied. You weren't some naive woman who needed saving." He swallowed hard. "You were everything I wasn't. You were kind when you had no reason to be. Strong when the world gave you every excuse to break." Her breath hitched. Caleb exhaled shakily. "I love you, Rosalind." She went still. And for the first time, she didn't look away. A decision to make the rain poured around them, but Caleb didn't care. He had nothing left to lose. Except her. Rosalind bit her lip, struggling. "I don't know if I can trust you again." His chest tightened. "I know." She hesitated. "And I don't want to be someone's lesson, Caleb. I don't want to be the reason you change." "You aren't," he said softly. "I'm changing because I can't be the man I used to be anymore. Not after you." Tears welled in her eyes. Caleb's heart pounded. Would she give him another chance? Or had he already lost her forever? The rain fell in heavy sheets, soaking through Caleb's clothes, but he didn't move. He didn't flinch. Because Rosalind hadn't walked away yet. She stood there, staring at him, her chest rising and falling unevenly. Her fingers twitched at her sides as if she wanted to reach for him, but something held her back. Fear. Not fear of him. Fear of hoping again. Caleb had spent his life winning. But this? This wasn't something he could win. This was something he had to deserve. And right now? He wasn't sure if he did. The one thing he never did. Before Rosalind exhaled shakily, crossing her arms, her voice barely above a whisper. "I don't know if I can forgive you, Caleb." He swallowed the lump in his throat. "I know." Her jaw tightened. "Then why are you still here?" He took a slow, steady breath. "Because for the first time in my life," he admitted, "I'm not walking away." Her lips parted slightly, as if the answer surprised her. Caleb had always walked away. From responsibility. From consequences. From anything that made him feel too much. But he wasn't walking away from her. Not now. Not ever. She gives him a choice. For the longest time, neither of them spoke. Then Rosalind took a step back, wrapping her arms around herself. Her eyes were softer now, but her voice was firm. "You say you love me." "I do." "Then prove it." His breath hitched. "How?" She studied him for a long moment before speaking. "Let me go." The words cut deeper than any insult. "Rosalind, you want to change?" she interrupted. "Then stop trying to fix this like it's one of your business deals. Stop chasing me like I'm something you need to win." Caleb's entire body tensed. She didn't understand. She couldn't. She wasn't just something he wanted to win. She was everything. And yet, he saw it in her eyes. She needed space. She needed time. She needed to believe in him without feeling forced to. Caleb's chest tightened painfully. Letting go had never been an option for him. But if he truly loved her, then maybe, just maybe, it was the only choice he had left. Walking away. For the right reasons, Caleb had walked away from a lot of things in his life. But this was different. This wasn't running. This wasn't avoidance. This was trust. Trusting that if he was truly worthy of her, she would come back. He reached into his pocket, pulling something out. A key. Her key. The one to his penthouse. Slowly, he reached for her hand, placed the key in her palm, and closed her fingers around it. Then, he met her gaze. "I'll be waiting," he whispered. And then, he turned and walked away. For the first time in his life, he left something he wanted more than anything. And prayed that one day, she would come back to him. Months later. Time passed. The world moved on. And Caleb? He stayed true to his word. He didn't chase. He didn't call. Instead, he continued his own transformation. He rebuilt himself, not as the billionaire who took what he wanted, but as a man who had learned the hardest lesson of his life. Love wasn't about possession. Love was about freedom. And if Rosalind was truly meant to be his, she would find her way back. Until then? He would wait. And hope. The day she finally came back, Caleb was at the community center, helping a group of kids with an art project, when someone called his name. He turned. And there she was. Rosalind. Standing in the doorway, watching him. His heart nearly stopped. She looked different. Or maybe, she had always looked like this. Strong. Beautiful. Confident. And completely in control of her own heart. For a moment, neither of them spoke. Then, slowly, she stepped forward. And smiled. Caleb had rehearsed this moment in his head 100 times. What he would say. What he would do. How he would make her see that he had changed. But now that Rosalind was standing in front of him, all the words disappeared. She didn't look angry. She didn't look bitter. She just looked at peace. And somehow, that scared him more than anything. The first words after so long. Caleb swallowed hard, setting down the paintbrush in his hand. Rosalind. She gave a small smile, stepping closer. Hi, Caleb. His heart pounded. The last time he had seen her, she had walked away. Now? She had come back. But, for what? The conversation that mattered most. She glanced at the children behind him, still laughing, still painting, still lost in their world of color and creativity. Then, she looked back at him. You stayed, she murmured. Caleb exhaled slowly. I meant it when I said I would. A pause. Then, she nodded. I know. The quiet acknowledgement hit him harder than any declaration of love ever could. Because she had seen him. Not the billionaire. Not the man who once treated love like a game. But him. The man who had spent months proving, not to her, but to himself, that he could be better. That he could be worthy. The hardest question. Why are you here, Rosalind? His voice was soft, careful. She hesitated. Then, she sighed, running a hand through her hair. For a long time, she said, I convinced myself that love was something people like me didn't get to have. That I had to be stronger than that. That I had to be okay with being alone. Caleb's chest ached. I told myself that when I walked away from you, it was the right thing to do. That no matter how much I had felt for you, the damage was done. And I couldn't forgive you for what you did. His breath caught. But, Her eyes met his, and for the first time, he saw something there he hadn't dared hope for. Softness. Hope. I also couldn't stop thinking about you. Caleb clenched his fists, forcing himself to stay still. She wasn't done. I saw what you did. Not just here, but in the way you lived your life after I left. You didn't just change for me, Caleb. You changed for yourself. A lump formed in his throat. I did, he admitted hoarsely. Rosalind exhaled. And I respect that. But I need to know one thing. She took a step closer. If I let you back into my life, are you ready to love me for real? Not as a bet. Not as a game. But as a choice? Caleb didn't hesitate. He reached for her hands, hesitant, uncertain if she would let him. But she did. He held them gently, not to claim her, but to show her he was hers. Rosalind, he murmured. Loving you has never been a choice for me. It's just who I am now. Her breath hitched. For a moment, neither of them spoke. Then, she smiled. A real, genuine smile. And he knew. She was coming back to him. Not because she had to. But because she wanted to. A love that was finally real. That evening, they walked through the town together, side by side. No cameras. No bets. No secrets. Just two people, finally free of the past. They talked. About nothing. About everything. And for the first time, Caleb felt something he had never truly experienced before. Peace. Love. Not the reckless, selfish kind he had once believed in. But the kind that meant something. The kind that lasted. As they reached her door, she hesitated, turning to him. So, she teased lightly, what now? Caleb smiled, brushing a loose strand of hair from her face. Whatever you want, he whispered. And this time? He meant it. The final lesson: love isn't something you win. It isn't something you take. It's something you give. And for the first time in his life, Caleb Vance understood. That was the only kind of love that truly mattered. And he was never letting it go again.